All right, welcome to ivySTAR Tutoring's magical world of the indirect object. So I very much hope that you already watched the video on direct objects because you're going to need to know that information in order to work on the indirect object because they sort of go together as a pair. Obviously, you can tell they have direct object in the name of the indirect object. So they're quite similar. All right, so let's start out first by doing our sort of background information about the indirect object, the way we did for the direct object. So the first thing we want to remember is just like the direct object, the indirect object is a noun, just like the direct object. Okay, they're both nouns. The next thing we're going to want to know is that, again, just like the direct object, the indirect object goes with an action verb. Okay, so we're used to that from the direct object. The next thing we're going to want to know is that the indirect object answers the question to or for what. So the direct object answers the question what. The indirect object answers the question to or for what. The last thing we're going to want to know is that in a sentence that has a direct object and an indirect object, this sort of order of things is going to be verb, indirect object, direct object. Okay, so that'll help us identify which is which in a sentence. Now, I'm going to tell you one extra piece of information, and that is that direct objects can be in a sentence without an indirect object. We saw that in the direct object video. You can have a verb and a direct object. However, an indirect object absolutely has to have a direct object in the sentence. So you're either going to have an indirect object and a direct object, or just a direct object. You cannot have the indirect object on its own. All right, so let's take a look at our sentences. And just like we did with direct object, we're going to start by circling our verb. All right, so she gave him the frog. How romantic. So our verb here is gave, so I'm going to circle that. Now, linking verb or action verb? Well, here we have an action verb, so we're good. We can assume we're going to have a direct object and or an indirect object. So now let's find our direct object first. She gave what? Well, she's not giving him. She is really giving the frog. This is where your sort of logical brain is going to have to come into play. So our direct object here is frog. She's giving what? She's giving the frog. Now we're going to get into our question for our indirect object, that to or for what. So we're going to say she gave the frog to what? Well, she gave the frog to him. So him is our indirect object. Okay, so again, she gave what? The frog, direct object, to what? Him, the indirect object. Okay, let's try our next sentence. Again, we're going to start with our verb. Your dog always gives me fleas. Okay, so our verb here is gives. Again, it's an action verb, so we know that we can have an indirect object or a direct object, or both. Let's figure out our direct object. Your dog always gives what? The dog's not giving me. The dog is giving the fleas. So fleas is going to be our direct object. Your dog gives fleas to or for what? Well, your dog gives fleas to me. So me is going to be our indirect object. Uh-oh, I switched the colors here. I had been doing direct object as green and indirect object as blue. My most sincere apologies. I'll try to switch back. So let's try our next sentence down here. I threw her a party. Okay, well, what's our verb? Okay, our verb is threw. Again, that's definitely an action verb, so we know we're on the right track here with indirect objects or direct objects. Now, here's an interesting question, right? We're going to find our direct object. I threw what? Well, I didn't throw her. That would be horrible. I threw a party. So party is our direct object. And we threw the party to or for what? Well, I threw a party for her. So her is our indirect object. Also, now notice this note that I gave up here, that it goes verb, indirect object, direct object. Notice how that's been working. Verb, indirect object, direct object. Verb, I-O-D-O. Verb, I-O-D-O. So this is a great hint, because if you're confused and you think that maybe her is the direct object and party is the indirect object, you can remember this little rule here and you'll know that it goes verb, indirect, direct. Okay, now I'm going to show kind of a tricky one. There's a little trick in terms of figuring out the indirect object when the sentence actually has a preposition in it like this. So it's similar to the sentence, I threw her a party, but instead we have, I threw a party for her. It pretty much means the same thing, right? It does mean the same thing, but in this sentence, we don't have an indirect object, and I'll show you why. So we're going to go through all of our system again. So our verb is threw. Again, that's an action verb. So we know that we can have a direct object or an indirect object. I threw what? Okay, now in this sentence, I threw a party. So the party is right here. That's our direct object. Now, do we have an indirect object in this sentence? Well, according to our order of things, we don't really have space for an indirect object in between our verb and our direct object. So we probably aren't going to have an indirect object. Now, I'm sure you're asking, but doesn't this answer the question, to or for what? Right? I threw a party to or for what? Well, I threw a party for her. And you're wondering, why isn't her an indirect object? Well, in this case, we have a preposition right here. And when you actually have the preposition to or for, you don't have an indirect object. It becomes an object of the preposition because you have a preposition right here. And we're going to get into that in the object of the preposition video. So you can watch that video to find out a little bit more about this. So when you actually use the words to or for, your noun becomes an object of the preposition. So the indirect object is a little stealthy. Like you can't actually have the words to or for. They have to be non-existent in the sentence. Okay, so that's sort of a tricky one. We'll try a couple more like that. Let's move on to our next set of examples here. Okay. Here we have, my friend sent everyone a tweet. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is find our verb. Our verb is sent. Again, it's an action verb. Okay, now my friend sent what? My friend sent a tweet. So that's our direct object. To or for what? They sent the tweet to everyone. We have our indirect object. So again, we have verb, I-O-D-O. Now, here's another one of the tricky ones. So this sentence looks like the same sentence as the one above it, right? My friend sent a tweet to everyone. So think about this, the tricky sentence we did on the last page, and let's go through this. So our verb here is sent. Again, action verb. My friend sent what? The tweet, that's our direct object, to everyone. Now again, it seems to answer the to or for what. My friend sent a tweet to or for what? Everyone. Except, ding, 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 we have that preposition there. Remember, the indirect object is super stealthy. We're not going to have any prepositions. So this is not your indirect object. In this sentence, we only have a direct object. You can also check it because there's no space to have the verb, the I-O, and then the D-O. So that's another trick sentence.